have been asked to keep the proceedings strictly on schedule. So we are moving on to our second keynote speaker today, who is Dr. Sonya Dewi, a landscape ecologist at the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, where she's been working since 2005. And her research focuses on the analysis of changing patterns of tree cover and its drivers, and on the quantification of ecosystem services and biodiversity in forest and agricultural mosaics. She has been actively involved in UN RED discussions and applications of land use planning for low emissions development strategy tools in Indonesia, amongst other places. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank you very much to Peter Verburg and the Scientific Committee to invite me here to share views, ideas, and also lessons learned, which mostly is drawn from the tropical areas, and in this case, it's from mostly from Indonesia, from Southeast Asia. Let me take you a little bit to the landscape where I belong to and where most of these lessons learned coming from. So this is a landscape from Sumatra Island in Indonesia. You can see this landscape is very much multifunctional. There are some paddy rice there. There are some secondary forest area which is still rich with trees, and also some rubber trees, some also fruit trees and timber trees. But despite of this looking well landscape, you can see as well that there are far back in the background, there starting some new establishment of some land use intensities in the sloping areas here. So this is a very typical sort of landscape in the areas, forested areas in the humid tropics. Just a little bit of the background as well. We come from an institution which is quite a bit different in terms of mandates compared to universities or academics community, in which we are pushed towards showing impacts as well as research papers, scientific findings, etc. Yeah. Zooming out a little bit of those landscapes, this is how we can see from afar. There's a mix of land uses. There are a mix of land cover here. In the far back, there are forests, there are secondary forests, there are tree cover, there are more intensified land use here. And within this, there are hidden some process in which local people, local farmers actually depend their livelihoods from the ecosystem services, from the particularly the provisioning part, and as well as some environmental service users in this area and also outside of the landscape. For example, we mentioned about RED+, about regulating climates, etc., which as well drawn the services that is provided from a landscape like this. And on top of that, there's government. There are several layers of government. There are local governments, there are national governments in which they make decisions often not in synchronized way. And also, of course, there are private sectors in which these private sectors is driven by some underlying global markets, for example. So there are investors from foreign countries, investors from the outside of the landscape that come here and see with the demand for land, for example, for acacia plantation, for pulp and paper, for oil palm, etc. Yeah, so there is multiple agenda of which often multiple objectives and multiple agents and stakeholders have to come up with some negotiation process in order to achieve agreement, cooperation, and co-investment. So taking this and bring this back to the topic of my presentation today, which is of land changes for conservation planning in the context of ecosystem services and biodiversity. Let's capture this in mind, the interaction between landscapes, multiple stakeholders, and also the drivers in a global process. So as for land governance, the cross-cutting issues we think is apart from those global mega topics that is now going on, there's land transition and changes, conservation planning, climate change, biodiversity and ecosystem valuation, and incentive systems. Often these are addressed separately in parallel processes in different scales by different stakeholders. And then also there's a big issue of linking between global processes where agenda is often defined to local realities where land changes occur. These links are often missing, such that creating science policy practice and back to science is non-trivial. Other than that, we need to actually, as I mentioned before, people like us from our institution, we need to push this, whatever we find from science process toward impacts to make a change on the ground through the behavioral changes of multiple stakeholders. And often linking those land science with decision makings in land uses is a boundary work in which there are many institutions, and it needs for that salience, credibility, and legitimacy. Cass et al. From 2013 to 2003 basically coined these three sort of principles that are needed for such boundary works. Here in this conference, within this mostly academic community, we talk a lot about credibility, the science that we produce, the findings, the research has to be credible, and organization like GLP has done a lot to make this relevance to the policy. But legitimacy part is another thing. Yeah, to push the science, the products that we produce, basically that is relevant. We need the legitimacy at the local level, as well as the national level, and perhaps at the global level, for those who have the legitimacy to take action, to make the policy, to be as well empowered and able to use our products. And then the last cross-cutting issues that I would like to mention here is about the planning processes. Most of the land-centric planning processes are not integrated. Usually they are done in parallel. Many of them, especially in the tropics, are not well informed with data, with model, with the research findings. And also, most of them are non-inclusive. Many of the planning process are done in a top-down manners. So this is 4 particular major processes in land governance that I would like to touch this morning. The first one is conservation planning. Second one is development planning. Sorry, for conservation planning here, I mean the land-centric conservation planning. I'm not going to touch about the marine and other sort. So this is mostly for terrestrial planning. And then development planning, in particular in rural areas, land-based sectors basically is as well the center of the issue in development planning. And not only land-based sectors, in rural areas, land-based sectors can be a multiplier effect to other sectors as well. Just for example, the establishment of oil palm that needs land can also generate income and labor in transportation, in industry, etc. Yeah. And then the third one is there's a huge agenda on quantification and valuation of ecosystem services and biodiversity, in which there's a huge discussion about incentive system in terms of payment for ecosystem services. And the fourth one in the major planning process is the land use planning at the local level. The first one for conservation planning, what is done usually is areas for conservation is prioritized using the range of tools. We have discussed a lot here, I think, within this conference in the many of the sessions. But often this sort of process is top-down, and then the agenda, the values are dominated by the outsider of the landscape, can be the government at the level above the landscapes, and often this doesn't recognize local values. And also, some of them using the highly technical processes of optimization, in which the results can be ideal, is the best situation that can be reached, but it might not be feasible to be done in that particular landscape. And also, the results usually is not easy to be interpreted and communicated to the broader audience, to the multiple stakeholders that indeed have the legitimacy to take it further. Another thing about conservation planning is the enforcement is usually weak. There are many papers that has already shown that the effectiveness of protected areas, for example, really vary from place to place. And also monitoring and ecosystem monitoring and evaluation system are not always in place. In many situations in the tropics, these monitoring and evaluation systems are not basically there. But the scientific community in there are advances here lately that now ecosystem services are being actually incorporated, internalized into the conservation planning. For example, here there's a review in 2013 by Simon Morin et al. That in terms of the trend now that for prioritizing conservation area, actually ecosystem services and biophysical indicators has been used to actually come up with the priority conservation areas. Also, the spatial congruence among ecosystem services has been used for conservation planning. And also, lately, the land sharing versus land sparing paradigms has already been taken and adopted as well for conservation planning. The second planning process is a development planning. Often growth rather than equity is the focus of the development planning. So mostly the indicators is GDP or regional GDP is being used as a tool. Labor absorption is often neglected in the development planning in the tropical areas. And then most of the planning is non-spatial, is not really consulting any other planning processes like conservation planning and also land use planning. And it's usually done in sectorally, in silos from one department to other department, while actually in the tropics where many of the population actually live in rural areas, land is basically is a central issue. And also development planning is often top-down. The engagement of civil society is often just a lip service. But when funding is involved, then another problem also rising, where usually the risk of elite capture is big in the landscape area. Also, development planning can be politically contentious, but luckily, lately, more recently, we are talking a lot in the global agenda about green economy, green accounting, and also some tools like social accounting matrix in which income distribution, labor multiplier effect is put into picture. And then I'll just go quickly through this, the quantification and valuation of ecosystem services and biodiversity. We talk a lot here in this conference, but I think ecosystem, sometimes we go too quickly between land use, land cover, nature capital into ecosystem services without thinking much about ecosystem function. So there's these natural capitals, actually there's some ecological function or processes in which ecosystem services can be produced, but also for that to be delivered to the users, there needs some enabling condition in which those particular discussion is sometimes missing. Yeah. And then a question whether valuation, monetary valuation is the best or the only way. We use a lot monetary valuation for trade-off analysis in terms of ecosystem services, but that could be not the only way. Yeah. And then we have been discussing a lot about PES, payment for ecosystem services, but lately there's a rethinking about this payment for ecosystem services. In particular, the article, the paper that is written by my co-author here in 2010 tried to clarify these three different categories of reward for ecosystem services. The first one is commodification, in which ecosystem services basically is traded just like other commodity, in which in the tropical areas in which land tenure is not very clear, land ownership is not very clear, commodification is often very difficult to be conducted. And then compensation for opportunity that is lost is the second categories. But the third one, which is more often and is most feasible to be done in the tropical areas, it's what's so-called co-investment. Yeah, I'll go quickly, yeah, because I got the sign. And internalizing these ecosystem services into land use decision and is very important. The fourth one is about land use planning. Land use planning basically is about supply versus demand. There are three particular things: regulation, allocation, and distribution. In which one particular remarks I would like to make here: in the tropical areas, the distribution is often inequitable. So this come with these three, actually four facets. The first one is conservation planning. The second one is then on the other side is development planning. There's biodiversity and ES valuation, and also the land use planning. This resembles perhaps the shape of an envelope. I'm not suggesting a back of the envelope calculation, but actually we can seal this, yeah, even though this each of this planning has its own dynamics. Land use decision basically is the center of that, and we can actually seal that, glue that through what is so-called planning unit. Yeah, we can develop planning unit as a key to ensure legitimacy, and also we can use land use planning unit as a currency to communicate, as a common language to communicate across those different planning processes. Yeah. So basically, planning unit can reconcile different perspectives of multiple stakeholders, can link to drivers, and also later on, it can link as well to the benefit sharing. So that's what we meant by planning unit. I'll just go quickly from this. I would like to share with you the example of the global to national to local policy to practices in the case of Indonesia. So perhaps you have heard about the Indonesia case, in which Indonesia from land-based sector mostly have been the third largest emitters in terms of greenhouse gas emitters globally. But then in 2010, our president has committed to reduce emission unilaterally as much as 26%, and also 15% in additional to that with multilateral funding. Yeah. So this is where the NAMA, the Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Action, come from, and most of those, the 26%, 41%, is coming from land-based sector. So that being said, targeted economic growth as much as 7% is also retained. But then how to translate this national commitment and policy to the local level? So this is basically the framework. People at the local level needs to develop the locally appropriate mitigation action, or LAMA. We call it LAMA. So it has to come up with historical emission, with the reference emission level, and then some mitigation scenarios in which the projected emissions from the mitigation scenario can be actually calculated. So within this, we as ICRAP in Indonesia has been called for help by the Ministry of State Ministry of Planning, in which we come up with some tools, because the people doesn't have tool actually to come up with this locally appropriate mitigation action. We develop a tool which is called LUAS, or Land Use Planning for Low Emission Development Strategy, which contains a framework of software that can accommodate what if scenarios and also trade-offs for negotiation processes. This tool can also be an educational and communication tools. So this is basically the steps in LUAS. The first one is for coming up with the legitimacy from others, multiple stakeholders, is to develop planning unit together. And then to estimate historical emission, we use the carbon stock differences, and then develop baseline scenario from the working group at the province level to do this, develop mitigation scenarios such that the projection of emission reduction can be done, the trade-off analysis of how much actually the cost incur to abate such and such emissions, and then to formulate action plan. I'll just go, LUAS application basically has been used in more than 30 provinces in Indonesia, and also going down to that is the 3 districts in Indonesia, because we know that RED Plus and NAMA is the national policy, but implementation actually is at the district level. We also have done this in 3 landscapes in Vietnam and Cameroon and Peru, and now we are working more in the more districts in Indonesia. So this is very quickly, this is the land use land cover maps of one particular district in that I showed before, yeah, the landscape there. It's in 1990 to 2010. You can see a huge changes there, and this is mostly what are the land use land cover there. Lately, oil palm has been dominating in terms of land conversion. There are rubber, there are acacia plantation, coffee garden, etc. This is the example of planning units, which is coming out from the negotiation processes among the local stakeholders. And this is the carbon density map. And these are the scenarios, basically mitigation scenarios that people come up with. You can see that the scenarios here actually are there. I display here 2 different scenarios. Scenarios are contains of activities that is planning unit specific. Yeah. So what are the specific activities that can be used, that potentially can be used as a part of mitigation scenario in, for example, protected forest, in protection forest, in production forest that has no concession, etc. Yeah. And these are more example. And this is the kind of graphics they can come up with, yeah, and also the way to compare between scenarios. And the working group also will come up with some implementation strategy. Once they come, they choose what scenarios are the best scenarios for them. They can go back and then identify what are the barriers actually to implement that particular activities, and what would be the implementation strategy. So from this, we'll go further to as well, including biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we are at the moment currently working on another set of tools, which we call LUMENS, Land Use Planning for Multiple Environmental Services, in which we will targeting the same principle, the same target audience and objectives. This is the landscape where we are from, where we are talking about in the context of the whole Indonesia. And using the forest transition theory, we come up with these clusters of district of Indonesia. So basically there are different typology of forest transition stages, from forest core, forest frontier, forest mosaic, urban and peri-urban, and our area is there under the forest frontier typology. And if we go further, this is what I did, the clustering analysis done for the whole tropical tropical region, in which we use watershed as a unit of analysis. The area where we are coming from is there. So in Indonesia now we come and work in different districts across the different typology of forest transition stages. And with that we hope this work can actually be upscaled or extrapolated to others. So just a bit of concluding remarks. This is now actually is a timely for us to bring together science, policy, and practices because of the driven by global agenda and trends of RED Plus, of IG target, etc. And more importantly, because the intervention actually push for performance-based monitoring and environment and evaluation system is very important, and this is where science can actually contribute a lot. And then we need to have operationalizing method for landscape approach, in which we show here that simple tools can find its ways actually when it's being adopted by legitimate land managers. So building evidence is very important, but also we need to be able to compare and to tell the story within the extrapolation domain that we are working in, such that the local studies can be linked into the global learning process. So with this, I'm going to say that we from the research institutions such as ICRA, we are twinners inevitably, but we are excited about that, because we try to assist how to this sort of landscape can be sustainable within the multi-stakeholder process. Thank you for being with me.